Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 1, Evolution of India's Worldview. And we start with topic British rule in India. The British rule in India helped evolve India's worldview in three ways. Firstly, it gives stimulus to the national movement for freedom, which in turn led to India's support for the freedom of dependent peoples all over the world. But merits and demerits of the British rule contributed to the growth of national movement in India. As regards merits, facilitating of communication through setting of communication network, introduction of the English language, laying of railways, and encouraging social reforms, and above all, bringing entire India under one administrative umbrella. The British rule contributed to the rise of nationalism in India. On the other hand, their racial arrogance, economic exploitation of the Indians, and excluding them from the power struggle structure contributed to the rise of national consciousness even among the wealthy class of people and who earlier supported the British rule. This growing political consciousness was translated into mass movement when beginning with the widespread protest against the partition of Bengal in 1905. Leaders like Aurobindo Ghosh, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and later on Mahatma Gandhi began to develop mass contact with their fingers on the pulse of the people. Freedom movements thus became a national movement for freedom and ultimately found its fulfillment in 1947. Under the circumstances, independent India's support to the freedom movement of dependent peoples all over the world was therefore not at all surprising. We are particularly interested, proclaimed Jawaharlal Nehru on 7th September 1946, outlining India's worldview in the emancipation of colonial and dependent countries and peoples. Secondly, the humiliation and suffering experienced by Indians due to the British racism made the leaders of independent India to strongly oppose racialism. Jawaharlal Nehru, in his statement on India's worldview on 7th September 1946, cited above, declared, "We repudiate utterly the Nazi doctrine of racialism, wheresoever and in whatever form it may be practiced." He reiterated this in the Constituent Assembly of India on 16th May 1949. Thus, one of the pillars of our foreign policy is to fight against racial discrimination. Thirdly, India's historic association with British rule obliged independent India not to snap all of its ties with Britain to avoid practical difficulties. Explaining the imperatives of the India's continued association with the Commonwealth of Nations headed by Britain, Jawaharlal Nehru observed in the Constituent Assembly. The House knows that inevitably during the past century and more all kinds of contacts have arisen between England and this country. Any marked change in this would, without something to follow, created a hiatus which may be harmful. Largely, our educational apparatus has been influenced. Largely, our military apparatus has been influenced by these considerations, and we have grown up naturally as something rather like the British Army. If we break away completely, the result is that without making sufficient provision for carrying on in a different way, we have a period of gap. If we do not want to pay the price, we should not pay it and face the consequences. Now, the next point is the Indian National Congress on India's worldview. Our discussion on the evolution of India's worldview would not be complete without a reference to the ideas on nationalism and internationalism championed by the Congress during the struggle for freedom. In fact, the leading members of Congress as early as 1921 intended the Congress resolution on international developments to be a guide to independent India's worldview. Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, declared, "Indeed, while we are maturing our plans for Swaraj, we are bound to consider and define our foreign policy. Surely we are bound authoritatively to tell the world that relations we wish to cultivate with it." The Jaipur resolution of Congress listed the promotion of world peace, the freedom of all nations, racial equality, and the ending of imperialism and colonialism as guiding principles of this organization. To this may be added one more, the duty of people of Indian origin settled abroad to identify themselves with the people of the country in which they had settled and not exploit them. Resolution after resolution passed by Congress in its successive sessions clearly outline India's worldview after independence on these lines. The Haripur Congress Resolution 1935, for instance, outlined India's worldview. Thus, the people of India desire to live in peace and friendship with their neighbors and with all other countries, and for this purpose wish to remove all causes of conflict between them. A free India will gladly associate itself with such an order and stand for disarmament and collective security. But world cooperation is impossible of achievement as long as the roots of international conflict remained and one nation dominates over another and imperialism hold away. In order, therefore, to establish world peace on an enduring basis, imperialism and exploitation of one people by another must end. Now let us have summary of the unit. The above account of evolution of India's worldview dating back to the ancient period shows that though both idealist and realist approaches to interstate relations existed in India, the idealist approach advocated by Buddha and Gandhi dominated India's worldview during the Nehru era, notwithstanding the recourse to violence in extreme cases such as India's military action for liberation of Goa. One may not, of course, argue that the Nehru's policy of non-alignment was as idealist as it appears to be. For an alternative policy on aligning with any superpower would have brought the Cold War to India's doorsteps and thereby jeopardized India's pursuit of autonomy and economic development. The policy of non alignment, for instance, served India's national interest by enabling it to ensure Anglo American assistance during the Indo India China War of 1962 and Soviet neutrality. At the same time, this enabled India to contribute towards world peace and decolonization. It is in this sense that the policy of non alignment reflected both idealist and realist traditions of India. It cannot, however, be denied that a doctrinaire approach to non alignment made Nehru to neglect India's defense preparedness, leading to its debacle on Chinese, which Nehru himself admitted after that traumatic experience in India's parliament. India's worldview turned to be more realistic after 1962, yet changes in India's worldview continued to take place only within the overall framework of continuity. Here we want to wind up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.